Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Wave Union, and in this one we're going to be covering these developments in detail. The Russians have managed to advance in the northern and southern flanks of Chasiv Yar while fighting over the industrial zone continues. In Toretsk itself there's been a significant breakthrough where the Russians are flanking the Ukrainian positions in the central parts of the city, and in the Kurakhove direction there are flanking maneuvers in the northern and southern flanks, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the flanks of Kurakhove, encircling the city. Starting out in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have been fighting over the industrial zone over the past few weeks, which is a very difficult position to take control of. The industrial zone has an underground area, therefore it will take a long time to clear such an area, and the Ukrainian forces are present within the city in the high-rise apartment complex buildings just next to the industrial zone, and this is where the central fighting over the city will take place. The Russians are now fighting heavily over this exact area, gaining control of which will allow the Russians to gain control over Chasiv Yar, as the remaining parts are simply in residential buildings with no significant defensive positions. The Russians would fight over the fortified areas, but would have control over the high ground in the central parts of the city, as well as the most fortified areas. At the same time, the Russians have advanced on the northern and southern flanks. This is to enter the residential area in the north, supporting the offensive towards the industrial area and the apartment complex area, while at the same time they are also developing offensive operations in the south. This is to cut off the Ukrainian counterattacks to regain control over the crossings across the canal. Instead, the Russians have made an additional crossing along the forest patches, where they're now fighting over the forest area to gain control over the fortified areas within it, and to cut off the Ukrainian counterattack. Gain control over the forest patch will allow the Russians to then enter into the residential areas in the western parts of Chasiv Yar and move towards the settlements surrounding Chasiv Yar, and to secure the southern flank of the central parts of the city. So heavy fighting is taking place in the northern and southern flanks of Chasiv Yar and in the industrial and apartment complex area in the central parts of the city. And just like other cities, the most important and decisive positions within the city is mostly always in the Donetsk region, the industrial zone and the apartment complex area. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the industrial zone and take several buildings along the mines in the southern parts of Toretsk, while at the same time they made a significant breakthrough flanking the apartment complex buildings and gaining almost full control over it in the central parts of Toretsk, leaving a small area in the gray zone as the Russians have yet to capture it. With this, the Russians would be in a position where they only have a small part of the industrial zone remaining under Ukrainian control, and from that the Russians will gain the upper hand in the Battle of Toretsk, and they will move into the western parts of the city and northern parts of the city to gain full control of it. In the battles that take place in Ukraine, I like to point out the objectives of the attacking force, which part is the deciding factor in a city to turn the situation around and turn it from a battle over the city into an inevitable control over the city. And in the Toretsk direction, it was and always has been three areas: the apartment complex area in the center, the industrial zone in the southern direction, and the industrial zone in the northern direction. Everything else is secondary to the operation. Everything else will come naturally following the capture of these three locations. The Russians now almost completely control the central apartment complex area. They have a foothold in and control parts of the southern industrial area, and they are within close proximity to the northern industrial area, following which the Russians would be half a step away from full control over the city of Toretsk. And what does that mean for the larger battle? It means that the general area between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to control. The Russians would slowly move up along the high ground through the fortified positions towards the city of Uspenivka to attempt to gain a foothold in that direction. take a look at the defensive lines of the Ukrainians. They have several lines to the east and to the south of the city. However, control over Toretsk will allow the Russians to flank several of these positions, flanking their fortified areas, as well as to bypass many of them by launching an attack through some of them, which at this point there's much fewer defensive lines and fortified positions north of Toretsk than there are in the other sections of the front line, where there has been less advances by the Russians. An example of which is the fact that the Russians here in the direction of Toretsk, the majority of the defenses the Ukrainians had prepared were within the city and ahead of the city, after which the defensive positions following the city have been less prioritized because they do not expect the first defensive lines to fall as they have. What we'll see towards the end of this year is the Russians are attempting to culminate the Battle of Chasiv Yar, the Battle of Toretsk, the Battle of Kurakhove, the Battle of Velika Novosilka, and also to begin the Battle of Pokrovsk, potentially ending it as well. The objective of which is all to improve their positions towards fighting over the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line, while others suggest an additional offensive towards the city of Dnipro along the Dnieper River. As the Ukrainians barely have any fortified positions in that direction, the Russians are at the final lines of defense in the Donetsk region in the southern parts of it, leaving only open fields and difficult terrain to defend on between the Russian positions and the city of Dnipro. This means that in general, the Russians will go mostly unhindered all the way to the Dnipro city, with only a few natural barriers, mostly flat ground, no industrial zones, no high-rise apartment complex areas, and simply a lot of vulnerable positions where they can hit the Ukrainians with artillery, drones, and FAB bombs. And this will be very costly for the Ukrainians to defend. In comparison, the Donetsk region is filled with industrial zones, apartment complex areas, and heavily fortified positions, natural barriers, hills, rivers, everything that you can think of to defend except for mountains, the Ukrainians have. Moving on to the northern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have advanced northwest of Citadel, where they're looking to cut off and close the pocket north of the settlement, and they're fighting over the fortified positions west of the settlement towards Shevchenko. Heavy fighting is taking place in this direction between Uspenivka and Citadel, as the Russians develop offensive operations there. In the flank to the south of Kurakhove, the Russians have flanked the Ukrainian positions near Hanivka, moving towards the eastern outskirts of Uspenivka, attempting to cut off the supply coming in and out of Hanivka, while at the same time fighting continues in Konstantinopolsk and Sukhyali. Based on this, we see that the settlements of Toretsk and Vasiliy, as well as Hanivka, are now cut off from supplies. The Russians are within close proximity of Toretsk, having full fight control over the entire settlement and the intersection north of the settlement, which is the supply line going into Vasiliy. The alternative supply line would be from Vasiliy towards Hanivka and then through Uspenivka, which is now also within fight control of the Russian forces, within direct fire of small arms. This allows the Russians to completely stop any flow of supplies in and out of the pocket, and the Ukrainian forces within it would have to break out of it by force, or they will have no supplies going forward. And this is a very difficult position for the Ukrainians to be in. The Russians also fighting over the fortified positions north of Uspenivka to gain control over the settlement itself, following which the southern flank will collapse of Kurakhove, to which the Russians can flank the Ukrainian positions towards Dashne or along the river lines towards Ulakli, where the objective would be to cut off the supplies to Kurakhove as well. This may merit a withdrawal from Kurakhove by the Ukrainian forces, while at the same time it is reported that additional reinforcements have been sent to this direction in terms of 3 battalions, which were recently formed and sent in this direction. According to these reports, the Ukrainians are planning counterattacks to free up some of their forces. This may be why the Russians are closing the pockets here near Uspenivka to gain control of it prior to a Ukrainian counterattack. In case the Ukrainians have sent 3 battalions to counterattack, we're already seeing the effects of the first one near Novi Kuma, where the Ukrainians managed to recapture the settlement and free up some supplies into Velika Novosilica. Other axes of counterattack operations could be towards Stary to push the Russians away from the northern flank, freeing up the supply line in and out of Kurakhove, as well as in the southern direction to attempt to free up some of the positions they have near the river line. The objective of the Ukrainians would be to secure control over this double road in and out of Kurakhove. This would mean the defense of Petropavlivka, Shevchenko, Dashne, Ulakli, and Konstantinopol. Any operations would be in the interest of this position, and therefore it is not really likely that they'll launch a counterattack in this direction, considering that it is already at a point of no return. The Russians will gain control of it, and gaining control of it will mean that the Russian positions will improve, but it's not a death sentence to the Ukrainian positions in Kurakhove, as they still have their fortified positions in the area. The Russians can actually move alongside it, flanking it, and especially from the northern direction, and this is why the focus of the Ukrainians would be in the Citadel direction. All in all, what we're seeing is that the Russians continue their offensive operations in the Kurakhove direction on both the northern and southern flanks to gain full control of the settlement. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.